Time out a second. You believe Bigfoot exists?
I think he does.
It's besides the point.
And I think he thinks Bigfoot eats corn dogs.
Welcome to the Witness Box, everybody. I'm your host, Joshua Diaz, alongside my co-host, Dr. Gary Bricado, author of The New Evil. Dr. Gary is a forensic psychologist. He is trained in almost everything that you can think of in the field of criminality and mass murder. Also, Chris McDonough, a homicide detective who has a solvability rate of over 90% in his career, and he's worked 300 murder investigations, and is it 500 death investigations?
Approximately, yes.
So, I mean, you know, once again, the credentials are just there. And so today we're going to talk about the mind of the political assassin. And through history, there have been many assassination attempts going back to the medieval times. It's just something that has been around for time immemorial. And again, you know, just about 10 days ago, we saw an attempt on a former president's life, former president, Republican nominee for president, and we saw an assassination attempt on his life. And we're going to talk a little bit about the mind of assassins. Dr. Gary and Chris, how are you guys doing today?
Well, how are you?
Outstanding.
Good deal. Awesome. And so, yeah, it's been interesting, you do witness history going all the way back to some of the most famous assassinations, or, Lincoln, JFK, there's a whole, even just the attempt on Reagan. There's so many throughout the years, and that's just the U.S. presidents. I think the United States has had, 4 presidents assassinated, and there have been 6 or 7 attempts, and you can add another one to the list. And the shooter himself is kind of a paradox, or an anomaly. Dr. Gary, can you talk a little bit about what you know when it comes to the mind of somebody along those lines?
Well, first of all, it's important to emphasize that we're talking about political assassins. We're not talking about assassins like, Mark David Chapman killing John Lennon, or Andrew Cunanan killing Andrew Versace, or something like that. We're talking about assassins of political figures. And particularly, we're really focusing on American political assassins, who are sort of a sub-breed. And I think the definitive study that was done of them was done by Clark. And Clark was the expert who delineated 4, I think, excellent subtypes for these kinds of people. And you'll see, if you look at he counted 16 incidences from 1835, when Lawrence tried to kill Andrew Jackson and failed because his gun malfunctioned, through 1981 with the assassination attempt on Reagan. And now we would add this one. I don't know if he's going to, to be honest, I'm not sure if Clark is still around, but if he is, I'm sure I'll be studying this. But that should give you an impression of how rare these incidences are. And those were not all on presidents or vice presidents. They're just, really prominent figures. There were also a smattering of attempts on members of Congress, and even times that there was successful attacks, and also attempted assassinations of members of the Supreme Court. Right. So, for example, to give you an idea of the 4 subtypes, what he would say is, first category is for people who are not psychotic, they're not delusional, but they have a mission that they believe comes from a higher place, and they think they're doing good for the society if they eliminate the person that they believe is evil. And that kind of person knows that he is likely to not survive the attack, So they go into it sort of like a martyr, with the idea being that they're going to lay themselves down on what they think is the altar of a cause. Now, the second category, which is where I think, as we'll see, Crooks probably goes, is a person who's not a psychopath, and they're not really psychotic. They can be depressed, they can be very badly bullied and traumatized, but they're a person who has intact feelings about other people. They feel hurt by other people, and they have a desire to kind of go out in a blaze and make something of themselves by doing something larger than themselves in their mind. And people like that are basically compensating for feelings of smallness. And the interesting thing about people like that is sometimes the killing of a prominent person is not really specific. It's just that they want to be able to say they did. And so people like that often have multiple targets in mind, and then wind up targeting a specific person. But the idea, as I always say, Chris knows this, that is really to tie yourself in history to that person, right? So now, if you Google Trump, you're going to see forever that there was an attempt on his life by this person. So now he has parasitically connected himself to the former president. The third category are people who are psychopaths, who, I always say, picture the Joker. Their goal is only to stir up anarchy. They're not really interested in the target's beliefs. They don't really have a side. They just think it's kind of amusing to stir up chaos. There's a nihilism to them. They kill just to prove the pointlessness of existence, how silly society is, the phoniness of everything, whatever. And the fourth type is psychotic. That type is operating because of voices, delusions, whatever. So, like, for example, an interesting case to think about is Hinckley, who thinks that if he, um, you know, targets Reagan, that he's going to impress the object of his obsessional focus, Jodie Foster, the actress Jodie Foster, whom he had targeted with hundreds, if I'm not mistaken, hundreds of notes slipped under the door of her dorm room and things like that. I always thought it was very interesting that she was the actress in the movie Taxi Driver, because in that movie, when Travis Bickle has his nervous breakdown, he targets a political figure. So my guess is that in some vague, deluded way, he thought, that he was going to impress her by bringing to life what happened in that movie. But it's a little unclear. And I think, those categories are pretty distinct. And I think they're a good launching pad for discussing. We could talk about a previous assassin. I have a thing or two to say about them, where they would go in that system. But I would start the conversation out by saying that everything we know about Crooks places him in category 2. He does not seem to be in category 1 because he did not have any kind of clear political affiliation or belief that he seemed to be serving, that was larger than himself in his mind, that we know of. He was not, according to his mental health history, psychotic or behaving in a disorganized, irrational way. I think we could rule that one out. And there's evidence from his life that he was a sensitive kid who could even be empathic. For example, witnesses said that he was the first person to help you with your homework if you needed help with it, right? He worked in a nursing home. Chances are this is not a psychopath. I think you wind up having to stick him in category 2. So I get a little confused when there's all this mystery about his motive. I mean, we could pretty much deduce which subtype he's going to fall into, and from that we could gauge a great deal about his profile. And everything that has come out has been supportive of that profile. So I think that's where we have to sort of start. And Chris, Josh, if you want to take it from there, any thoughts or?
Well, I think it's always fascinating, Gary. I mean, you're always insightful, and I think what's going to be interesting about this conversation tonight is, as we talk about these individuals who select political targets, and there's an interesting thing. I'm just actually reading up on it again. Is during Lincoln, I guess we'll talk about Lincoln just for a moment with John Wilkes Booth,
Sure.
where it's interesting. In Lincoln's second inaugural address, he deemed the war casualties as God's will. And it just so happened that at that speech was John Wilkes Booth. And that speech occurred October 14th, 1865. And in there, if somebody has never gone to the Lincoln Memorial, there's an inscription on the Lincoln Memorial that says, among the small handful of semi-sacred texts by which Americans conceive their place in the world. And that is a reference to a speech that Lincoln gave in relationship to kind of tying the sacred sacrifice of life during the Civil War. And he gave that paragraph in his second inaugural address. And you wonder that what was going through Booth's mind when he hears this, and you hear now information coming out. I don't know if they're going to be able to peg this guy as politically motivated as a whole, or if he is, like you're talking about category 2, Gary, where he's just kind of, just soaking up. I don't even know how to describe him yet. I mean, how would we describe this kid at this point outside of just putting him into this category?
Well, I think that, to be honest with you, and perhaps I'm in a unique position to talk about him because of the Columbia Mass Murder Database that I co-authored, right? But to me, he had attempted to be, it was essentially a garden variety mass shooter. It's just that there were not enough people who passed away to meet the criteria for that. But he went there with 50 rounds. I mean, this was supposed to be a mass shooting. The going up on the roof, perching himself on the roof, is reminiscent, for example, of the worst mass shooting in U.S. history by Stephen Paddock, where he was up in the hotel, perched above the festival, and just shot into the crowd and wound up killing more people than any mass shooter in our entire history. I think this was supposed to be a mass shooting incident, and the fact that there would have been a celebrity figure, in that crowd was like so much gravy for him. But I don't think that it was the entire focus. It was to go out in a blaze, to compensate probably for being kind of pathetic. And I think shooting is just something he was good at. I mean, remember, with the shooting range and so forth, this is something that he would have been considered good at. And I think it figured into this being symbolic of trying to compensate for poor esteem. I will say, the Lincoln assassination is quite fascinating on a lot of levels, but we have to talk a moment about the psychology of Booth. Booth was a prominent actor of the 19th century. He was part of a very prominent acting family. His brother, Edwin Booth, was arguably the greatest actor in theater of that entire portion of American history. And his father, Junius Booth, was also very prominent. And it's interesting to think about the assassination of Lincoln as almost a kind of weird over-identification with the killing, with the role, the Shakespearean role in Julius Caesar, of Brutus assassinating Caesar. And in fact, in the best book ever written on Booth, he is referred to as the American Brutus. I think as an actor, he had a weird over-identification with that figure. And much like Brutus, there was a whole cabal, right? It wasn't just one person to commit the assassination. It was a group. There were a whole slew of people that they intended to eliminate, right? In the Lincoln cabinet and so forth. And but I think he was an overcompensator, a grandiose overcompensator. Now, the interesting thing is Clark puts Booth in category 1 as somebody who really, truly saw himself as delivering the nation from evil in his mind. But I think he was a category 2, a kind of pathetic narcissist who wanted to go out in a blaze. He literally went out in a blaze, by the way. He was shot and burned in a barn when cornered there. But it's a fascinating story. And remember, Chris, that John Wilkes Booth was present at the execution of John Brown. And you remember John Brown, if you know your history, John Brown was the man who, in October of 1858, I think it was, led a mob to try to start a race war where African Americans would rise up against their masters, enslaved African Americans. He was going to arm them. I think 16 people died in that incident. He was killed. Half of the country saw him as a hero, abolitionist. The other half of the country thought he was a monster. Wilkes went to his hanging. He was called the meteor of the war by one poet because what he basically said at the time of his execution was he foresaw that the slavery matter would have to be dealt with in blood. Lincoln took a religious interpretation at one point, Chris, which is what you were alluding to, where he felt that the war was necessary for America to compensate for the sin of slavery. He saw it as almost like a spiritual balancing act where a terrible thing had happened and we were going to have to pay for it. And but it is interesting to think about how this kid, only 20 years old, Lord knows what was going on with him, he has managed to be a John Brown figure where there are people, and it disturbs me because, let me be crystal clear, I think you guys would agree, there is no place in our political rhetoric for an assassination attempt. I don't care what you think of somebody. That's being on the table. Zero, zilch. And there are people who will say in private, he thought he was getting rid of an evil person. I understand what he was thinking. And there are other people who will say, this is a great man. Why would somebody want to do that? And other people will say, I don't care what you think. There's no place for that. And so you're seeing that dividing up of the country like that, and that scares me. And so I think, again, we have to emphasize there is no place for that. You settle political matters in words, not with bullets. And you certainly don't, and I think you would agree, you see the grandiosity of thinking that you're going to settle what you think is a political matter yourself. You're making a decision for everyone, yourself. And, that's disturbing too. So I don't know what you guys think about those points. But I think
real quiet over there.
But what do you think about those points? I mean,
well,
the division of the country over this and everything.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there should be no division.
I agree
about an assassination attempt. Trying to kill somebody is just wrong. Trying to people in harm's way. If, like you said, if his motive was like a spree killing with one of the most powerful people in the world on the stage, and if he could take him out and other people at the same time, then there's not much political about that. But an assassination attempt or attempted murder is just terrible, and shame on people that would root that on. There should
an attempted mass murder. That's what's really disturbing about this. I mean, there are a lot of things that are disturbing about it, but I mean, he had 50 rounds.
Right. Yeah. No, he was going for it. There's no question about it. And
explosives.
Right. And it's interesting too when you were talking about the assassination of Lincoln. Like, that was actually a very coordinated attempt. They were trying to take out the Secretary of State. They were trying to take out the Vice President. They thought that the Confederacy was going to reign supreme again. They were going to do something major, and it failed. And unfortunately, which is just, Lincoln was the only one that died. Nobody else died. And I think one of the assassins that was supposed to go after, I believe Andrew Jackson was the vice president at the time. He ended up getting drunk instead, and not fulfilling what he was supposed to do. So, right. A great man in history, Abraham Lincoln, one of my favorite topics. It was just a shame that he was the only one that ended up dying that day. Another thing too is I was getting contacted after this happened. My kids weren't home, and they were calling me. Did you see what happened? Did you see what happened? And I'm just really thankful that we don't have that image of somebody getting their head blown off again, like JFK. I mean, because nobody needs to see that. I mean, it's terrible. And then there was a person behind the podium that passed away that was guarding his family. The whole thing it's just completely tragic and honestly
Right.
non-political. It really is not a political thing. Those people that were out there are our brothers and sisters, and doesn't matter what side we're on of anything. They're human beings, and I became a little bit emotional learning that he shielded his kids like a true father, a true hero. And but nothing good comes out of those situations, and I would be curious, Dr. Gary, to hear more about talking about motive. But you think that he was just a mass spree killer wannabe.
Well, I think the point is that we know from mass shooters who seek infamy and who seek to compensate for feelings of smallness that the idea is to go out in as big as of a blaze as possible, either in terms of the victim count or in terms of one or more of the targets being prominent. And we know that if news reports are to be believed, there are other people he seemed to have been eyeing. He was looking up other folks, right? So it does seem, think for example of the non-political assassin Andrew Cunanan, who assassinated Versace, right? He had originally wanted to kill other people, including Madonna, singer Madonna. There's no particular gripe towards the person. It's just that the person is prominent and it would be a history-changing event.
You're right.
So a person who feels invisible now doesn't feel invisible anymore. Incidentally, since you talked about the chaos of the other people working with Booth, I think the most disturbing image out of that whole thing was Powell, who was supposed to kill Seward, Secretary of State, who's famous, of course, for the purchase of Alaska and Seward's Folly. And that's very interesting because, in an attempt to get to Seward, 8 people were stabbed, including some of Seward's own kids. And the only reason Seward lived is because he happened to have a thing around his neck to hold his jaw up because of an unrelated issue. And when he was stabbed in the jaw, that brace that was around his chin protected him, and he lived. It was just a sort of one of those weird coincidences that you could look at through a few different lenses, but that's why he lived. And it is interesting to think about that butchery, just the sheer bloody butchery of that event within that wider thing. I mean, we hear about the killing of Lincoln, who suffered, by the way, a very great deal. He didn't die abruptly. He died, with his long legs draped over a bed. It was far too little for him, and it was really. There is a famous story told, by the way, although there are some historians that question it because it wasn't written down until about 20 years afterward. But there is a famous story told that he had a premonition of his own death. And because Lincoln, who was very interested in spiritual things and had seances in the White House and everything else, he was very interested in dreams. And he had a famous dream in which he came down into the White House and saw a casket that was draped, I believe, with a flag, and asked someone who was in the coffin, and he was told that the president had been killed by an assassin. And then the story changed over time, and so forth. But that is a famous story. Whether it's apocryphal or not is a matter of some historical question. But it is intriguing to think about. But I think, Chris, you would agree that the assassination of Lincoln had more of a unifying effect for the country, right? Lincoln's body went on a train all around the country. Everybody wanted to see it. People suddenly realized the absurdity and awfulness of that war, and we went into Reconstruction. But it became like a sort of symbolic end of the war, which was still lingering on with little skirmishes here and there. And some people would say it's still going on in some ways. But I think this thing could have a unifying effect, or it could have a terrifying John Brown effect. And I think we don't know yet. We don't know yet. I'm afraid of copycats. I'm afraid of people being inspired by this. I'm afraid of the rhetoric that demonizes people because we don't agree with their political beliefs. I think, for example, the comparisons to some of the most evil historical figures that ever lived can be very dangerous. People have to be very careful with that. No matter what you think of a person, you should not. It's irresponsible, I think, to do that. I don't know what you guys think, but I think the rhetoric has got to be cooled because there are a lot of people out there that are loose cannons.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
makes
and
nothing better. It's made everything worse.
Dangerous, very
Yeah.
dangerous. Yeah.
I unfortunately, right? I mean, all of us here, all the three of us here, would agree that temperature needs to
Yes.
absolutely plummet.
Right.
But
Right.
the scary part is what does social media play into these political players like this, that, or at least into the loose cannon here? I mean, Gary, you've got 119 years or whatever it is of research on mass shooters. And, I mean, if we go back to your point a moment ago about Abraham Lincoln and, Booth, yeah, Lincoln was a spiritual figure. The country had just come off of the war. He was trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I reconcile with the South and bring everybody into the same, bucket here? And it just seems like we're the polar opposite of that right now, where there's this, and I think it needs to be talked about, objectively and agnostically away from politics. But
Yeah.
we just need to talk about the human condition here that this country is in. I mean, we have all of this rhetoric that we're talking about,
Yeah.
just exploding onto the scene,
Right.
and it's so easy for people just to arbitrarily, stick their, a fork in the ground or a stick in the ground and say, well, this is just the way it is, without realizing the damage that everybody, both sides, any side, is accomplishing. That they're destroying the ability to have civil discourse.
Exactly.
How do we fix it?
Well, first of all, to me, one of the most dangerous things about social media is that the way the algorithms generally work is that you're going to see more of what you like. And as a consequence, you're going to be reinforced. So if you like somebody's opinion, you're going to see a lot more like them. If you like a certain movie, a certain book, you're going to see a lot more like that, etc. And as a consequence, you wind up in a kind of echo chamber where you have an opinion or you believe something, and you're only going to get things, reinforcement of that in your brain over and over and over again. And you're going to see a lot of people who are attacking anybody almost like they feel like they're like an immune system attacking a foreign splinter coming into the body. It forms a little body and it pushes out anything that it doesn't agree with. So a person comes in, bravely has a different opinion, they get chased off, destroyed, and you're back in the echo chamber. And I think that's extremely dangerous. I also think it makes stars out of nobodies. Anybody could manufacture fame today, and put it on social media. It's really disgusting. There was an incident. There was a woman who was an internet figure called Bianca Devins, and in 2019 she was killed, brutally killed, in Utica, New York. And a kind of a jealous, inadequate guy basically photographed that he had butchered her. Her head was almost completely removed and so forth. And then he basically slashed himself and went under a tarp, and the police came and found him like that and the whole thing. And I remember that I was on social media, on Instagram, and before it got taken down, someone had shared the image of this woman with her neck completely severed and her head all the way back, with the blood everywhere. And then it was taken down immediately. But for a minute there, for a hot minute, that picture was all over the place, and there it was on my screen, right? I still remember seeing it.
Hmm.
And in that moment, that guy felt that he had achieved something, that her public humiliation, and through that, and that kind of thing horrifies me. That is a new evil that Michael Stone and I have talked about. The use of the internet to magnify the humiliation of a person, to magnify one's own importance, right? To scare people, etc. And I think in general there is a kind of grandiosity to a lot of people to think they're important because they have a big audience on the internet. And some of them just manufacture their fame. They make up their credentials. They make up their their importance, and people follow it. All you got to do is wrap something up as famous, and people will think it's great.
Dr. Gary, I completely agree with you, and Chris, I do too, about the rhetoric. But here's where I think the problem is, and I think about this quite often, and I've thought about it for some time, because the political climate in the last 15 years has just been absolutely nuts. And I think that if we're being honest, which I don't think most people, I think most people are, but I think a lot of people are phonies. They'll say what is politically correct, but that's not really how they feel inside. Now, the outside rhetoric may be, oh yeah, this or that or this, and that they don't actually believe it. So unless you're going to be willing to have an honest conversation about stuff like this, in my world, how I feel about these sort of things is I've put people on pedestals before and I've been let down, and people have put me on pedestals and I've let people down. And I mean, when it just comes down to just being, the decent human thing, if there are people that aren't being honest about their feelings, like, there are people, that hated Ronald Reagan. They were upset when he didn't die from his assassination attempt. I mean, that's a truly terrible way to feel. And it's wrong. Fundamentally, and just in every single way, it's wrong.
What's the disconnect with people, do you think, Josh?
I think a lot of it, Chris, is probably like they see people on TV and they're almost not like real people. Okay. Like to us, like they're just these polarizing figures, yet they have kids and grandkids and brothers and sisters and not everybody's a great person, but that does not mean, that means nothing when it comes to somebody trying to kill another person. And I just don't like, it's like when people want to talk about racism, well, you can walk up to somebody and you can say, are you a racist? And they'll go 99.9% of the time, they go, no, because that's the right thing to say. But what if you walk up to somebody and go, are you racist? You go, and this person says, you know what? I have in my heart, some issues that I can't work through. And then you can have an honest conversation because that person is telling you how they truly feel without it being, this, you're a blatant racist, or no, you're asking somebody a question and they're being honest about it. And then you can have an honest conversation. The problem is it's like Bigfoot, nobody's seen Bigfoot, but everybody believes it exists. We all agree that racism exists, but nobody's going to say, yeah, dude, I'm a racist, or yeah, there are, and I've seen this, people get so comfortable online.
Time out a second. You believe Bigfoot exists?
I mean,
I think he does.
All those
I know where he lives.
You should see where I live, dude.
I'm going to get some pictures. And I think he thinks Bigfoot eats corn dogs as well.
I believe racism exists more than Bigfoot. How's that? But, and I'm just using racism as an example because nobody wants to admit. There are, like you said, Chris, there are people out there that are going, shucks, he didn't die. What a terrible thing to say about somebody.
Yeah, isn't that interesting though, that we as a society have gotten to a place, and we've had this conversation multiple times, all of us. And I think all of it just comes down to, the fact is there's only two real forces in the world, right? And however they get described by various people and all people. I mean, there's a variances in relationship to definitions. But, a simple one for conversation is the word evil. And of course, the second one for conversation is the word good. And, I mean, this is a battle of good and evil. And there are evil people, that meaning they choose to do bad things, wrong things. They choose to hurt, they choose to hate, etc. And racism is nothing more than just a magnified hatred.
Yeah, and that was just, by the way, that was just an example.
No, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, but here's the problem, Chris, with what you're saying.
Mhm.
Is that evil is sometimes in the eye of the beholder. For example, anybody who attempted to assassinate Hitler would probably be considered quite heroic
Mhm.
from our point of view. And the whole trouble is that if you are indoctrinated with the idea that a certain figure is evil, if you were a Category 1 assassin, you would think you were doing good by
Yeah.
eliminating. That's the danger of comparing people to evil historical figures, because you're basically saying this person is an archetype of such evil that they have to be eliminated from the world. That's the danger.
But,
and we have to be careful with that.
But Dr. Gary, I don't think anybody outside of the Nazis thought what they were doing was acceptable, right? The whole world, except, I mean, Japan maybe, but the whole world condemned what was going on. And I get what you're saying, but the very untold things about Germany and World War II is there were a ton of assassination attempts on Hitler, and there was a huge underground resistance against Hitler. And in history is really the one that dictates whether this was right or wrong. And obviously those people that tried to overturn that empire or whatever, the Third Reich, they were actually doing it for the right reasons. You know what I'm saying? And a kid like the Crook's kid, there was no reason for what he was doing. None.
Well, we don't know if he was indoctrinated by some particular school of thought, but it appears he was indifferent to that. It appears that his goal was to commit a mass shooting to maximize a sense of power and attention on the way out of what was a sad life of having been treated a certain way and feeling a certain way about people. And now he went out a kind of historical figure, as much as I hate to call him that. I don't even want to say
I mean, it goes down in history. No question about
it. He
it.
knew that he would. I mean, that's the key to it.
That's what the Columbine boys wanted. That's what a lot of, and you know this, Dr. Gary, more than most. That's what a lot of these guys want. They want to be on CNN. Remember the Virginia Tech shooter? Remember when he emailed, or remember when didn't he send a bunch of videotapes to ABC and
he made
a manifesto or a vlog? Yeah,
right.
And he sent it to CNN, knowing that by the time it got there, he was gonna have already done at the time one of the worst mass shootings in the history of the United States, and he wanted his. And obviously they put it out because it was good. It was, good ratings and stuff like that. And I don't know. I'm sure you've seen it, Dr. Gary and Chris. I don't know if you have. It's disturbing. And, I'm always conflicted about that kind of stuff. Like, why do we need to see that? Why, but I know professionals like you do need to see it. But, to me, it's almost like when you put that stuff out there, it's like, on a much smaller level, but when somebody, runs onto the field at a major sporting event, they just stop showing them on TV. They just won't show them anymore because what they want is the attention. They want to be on the news. They want to be on Sports Center. They want to be on, and a lot of these people are just looking to make their mark in the world politics be damned. They just want, like you said, Cunanan. You know, when he'll forever be a link to Versace, and
Right.
I'm sure that the family hates that. You know.
Well, but you see, when people become very fixated on a particular political movement, and it becomes part of their identity, and they're screaming and yelling at people over it or getting aggressive over it, in a way, they're doing the same thing that the offender did. In other words, you gain an identity through who it is you hate, because they are not me. In them not being me and us being this, we are something that they are not. It's an us against them. In other words, you have to understand it that for a lot of these guys, it's a kind of a way of having a purpose, an identity, a life meaning on the way out the door. And they don't really have a clear side or a clear personality or a clear anything. And so that it doesn't surprise me there was no clear political affiliation to the guy. He was just sort of a lost soul in that identity blob. And I think that's the whole point is that by identifying something that you're mad at or whatever, it gives you a kind of a scope, a purpose, a meaning. And I think that's what a lot of these guys are missing. That's the whole thing. But there is definitely a pandemic of these young, Caucasian, sexually frustrated guys that go out there and commit these atrocities. And we have to think about what the heck that's about, too. Does that have to do, for example, with a group of people who historically once had all the power and now feeling that it's been taken from them? Is there some sociological thing that, does it have to do with that we teach young men that they have to be aggressive to be a man? That's how you settle scores. I don't know. I only know that it's a guy thing. You're 8 times more likely to be aggressive if you have testosterone, right? What I mean, that's for sure. I think the statistics say, if I'm not mistaken, 94% of mass shooters are males, right? There's a little fragment.
When did the mass shooting phenomena really start to take off?
Well, it's an interesting question. It gradually increased from the 1970s when there was wide scale availability of military style firearms, but it really became a phenomenon in the US with really starting with Columbine about 1999. Until the late 90s, serial killing was more common, and now that's decreased enormously. And around the same time, mass shootings went through the roof. And so that's another interesting question
But AR-15s weren't on the street until the late 80s.
No, not AR-15s, but other kinds of weapons that you
Like,
could purchase.
Like what? What
So
kind?
like an Uzi, for example.
Or AK.
Okay.
Right.
Well, okay.
Like
Go ahead.
military style weaponry. In other words, things that were not supposed to be in civilian use.
Got it.
Right. Or people, I'm sure, Chris, you know that people figured out ways to alter firearms to make them.
They weren't prevalent. I mean, I started on the
like
street
now.
in 1982.
Right.
And to have anybody with an assault weapon in any way, shape, or form.
Rare.
SKS, AK-47, AR-15, M16, it just didn't exist.
Very rare. I agree with you.
Because everybody would have seen it in LA for sure. I mean, those gangbangers up there would have utilized those weapons. I mean, they were happy just to get hold of a 9mm pistol, semi-automatic pistol. But when I think it was Reagan who lifted the ban, or Clinton who lifted the ban. I don't remember who it was.
No, Clinton placed the ban, I think.
Did he replace it? Did he put it back?
No, I think he was the one who placed it.
Well, it was lifted because I went to the very first shooting. Well, one of them in our area. It was a sheriff's deputy, and his whole car was peppered. And I came around the corner because we got the call to go cover them, and I came around the corner, and his entire windshield had probably 30 rounds in it, and he hit the floorboard. And by the grace of God, he didn't even get hit. Okay. And that was my first brush with an automatic, well, semi-automatic type of weapon like that, field weapon like that. And then, of course, later in the 90s, I had cases. I've shared that one, the case where I had 5 people shot at a quinceañera with an SKS that was smuggled in a Humvee, in the wheel well in a Humvee from the first Gulf War.
Jeez.
It was sold to gang members, and they utilized that weapon that evening. But that said, when did this phenomena really start to blast off in your research, Doc?
After Columbine.
Okay,
Roughly
so
at the turn of the last century, this constant barrage where you can almost predict you can predict a constantly increasing number of mass shootings annually in the United States. And incidentally, I'll tell you a story. Michael Stone, my mentor, as everyone knows, who co-wrote The New Evil with me, he always told me, I think he included this story in his book, The Anatomy of Evil, I think, but I'm going to include it in the new book, I think. But he told me a story that after Sandy Hook, he went up there and law enforcement wanted to show him the power of the AR-15 that was one of the 3 firearms used by Lanza. And he told me, now listen, I wasn't there to see it, but he told me that they got some watermelons that were roughly the weight
explode
of those little kids and shot them with the AR-15s to show what would happen. And they were totally gutted out. I mean, they were blown to smithereens. I mean, you get hit with an AR-15 bullet, Chris, it's pretty ugly. I mean, those bullets are designed to be difficult to remove.
I've stood over the victims, and I know what it's like. In fact, we used to do recreations like that using alarm bells. That's how I knew what you were going to say.
Yeah.
And we would videotape it for a jury and show them. But before even that, okay, the weapon of itself is horrific, no question about it.
It's a weapon of war. It was used with the intention of mass casualties. Yeah,
but they used to drive to school with rifles on their racks in rural America, and these kids were not getting out of the cars. They weren't taking the rifles in the school and wiping out the school. Okay, so I think we're missing the elephant in the living room sometimes.
Something's culturally changed.
And right, there's a mental disorder or something is happening where nobody wants to approach the idea that says, you know what, and maybe you can do this with all of your research because you have the credentials to do it. You just start screaming to the public, i.e. to Congress even, to say, look, let's create a category of mental illness that is susceptible to mass shooting and name it, whatever it's going to be named. And because the U.S. Secret Service just did a study, the most recent one, probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, where they looked at every school shooting, and you probably know which one I'm talking about.
Study intimately, yeah.
Okay. So I was there when they rolled it out in Florida. I was actually in the room with the doctor. I forget her name. You probably know her. She's probably one of your colleagues. And she got up, did the presentation. I was in the room when they gave the presentation. And they had the father of one of the Columbine victims. They were there to support, the findings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think by removing the mental health barrier in this country has contributed to the mass shootings that are taking place today. And that's just my opinion. You're the expert. I could be way off, but I don't recall, even in my career in the early 80s when I started, having to turn the TV on every single day and see, holy cow, here's another. And I think mass shootings are getting categorized even crazier because the gang members have been shooting each other forever, with pistols, and now they've just got more sophisticated, And the politicians have all jumped on and said, wow, see there, we've got another mass shooting. Well, those mass shootings, they used to call them drive-by shootings. Now they're mass shootings. Okay, well, they shoot 4 or 5 people a night and nobody would blink an eye in South Central Los Angeles. And I think everybody on this,
well, what's considered a mass shooting?
I will tell you that there's a problem with the research in that some studies include gang violence, but they really need to isolate personal cause mass shootings to really understand them. I just want to comment quickly on the mental illness point. First of all, if serious mental illness like psychotic disorders, where a person doesn't know what he or she is doing or something like that, were to blame, then you would see an even number of these incidences across time and space as long as there were guns in existence. The change indicates that something cultural happened. Clearly, somewhere around the 60s and 70s, something happened. I can tell you authoritatively that serious mental illness characterized by psychosis is rarely associated with mass shooting incidences. It's very, very low, about 8%, you would say, and 12%, 8 to 12%, I would say, of mass murders are associated with serious mental illness. But under the umbrella of mental health falls the other stuff that does seem to be associated with this, like lacking coping skills, grieving, narcissism, explosive rage, holding grudges, having been traumatized, etc. And so if what you mean by mental illness is that stuff where people lack coping skills, yeah, I agree that that's a mental health issue. But as far as mental health, like being out of one's mind, so to speak, that is overblown in terms of its relationships with, and so, like, for example, there is no formal mental health history with this Crooks boy.
No, but if we take,
but he had coping skills problems. He was traumatized, probably. I mean,
let's stay on that lane. Okay, let's stay in that lane together.
I think Josh had something he wanted to add.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
No, I didn't.
No, because you started to say something and then you didn't get to say.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt either if I stepped on you, but I want to stay in this lane with you because I think it's a fascinating,
it's interesting stuff.
Conversation because
wanted to be a shooter, right? So
we have a political problem here with this guy, with this kid. Not necessarily his motivation, but there's obviously he's at a political event, etc. I mean, I think I agree with you 1,000%. He would have gone to any event if it would have been flashing, big red lights in front of him, or am I wrong there from your perspective? If hypothetically, if it wasn't that event, would he have gone to a school, like he's studying, this other Michigan shooting up there? I think he probably would have, but I could be totally wrong.
He would have picked a different prominent person.
Well, dig into that. The Michigan connection.
Yeah, well, we know, for example, that Crooks was interested in, and he had on his phone, for example, an image of Ethan Crumbley, the Michigan school shooter. Right. We know he was interested in studying him, right? A very interesting case there. Again, of a kind of inadequate, picked on, oddball kind of kid. Now, I think Crumbley was arguably more authentically unwell, more traditionally unwell. There are stories about Crumbley that are very different than the stories you hear about Crooks. I'll give you a simple example. There's a story I heard about Crumbley. I never forgot it because it was so horrifying to me. And the story was, now I have to confirm if the story is true, but this is what I heard. The story was that everybody's out in his school playing in the yard. And apparently Crumbley goes up on the roof and hurls down into the schoolyard the severed head of a deer. Now you got to picture this is an unwell kid, right? Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, and that's why that case got so controversial because, I mean, you're talking about a situation where knowing that your child is disturbed like that, you have the parents giving firearm to the kid and helping him to conceal it, right? Supposedly, right? Remember they went on the run and the whole thing. That's a very controversial case because that opened up the dam in terms of where liability falls and whatever. But it is very interesting that this kid would have been interested in all the shootings. Why that one? What's that about? I mean, there are so many mass shootings. We know that other mass shooters are fascinated by other mass shooters, right?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe it was
Like,
the most recent.
I don't know. I think it says something about. I think the choice of who it is. There were so many mass shootings that between.
I think you need, Gary. I think you need to, under the American Psychiatric Association.
Yeah.
I think they need to listen to you a little bit deeper here, and really categorize these, the mental health aspect of this. I mean, because what happens on the political spectrum is the politicians immediately go after the guns. Okay. Meaning the conversation does not even touch. And I think we saw this today in this political, bipartisan committee where they were talking to the U.S. director of U.S. Secret Service. There was some deviance in relationship to, not talking about what happened, but what was used to make it happen. And I think that is the elephant in the living room sometimes. And because I'm more interested and fascinated by the fact that to try to prevent these types of things from occurring by early intervention. And that's where the U.S. Secret Service, in their study on mass shootings, they came out right out front and talked about intervention programs. They didn't talk about guns. Because what they did is they talked about guns as being the tools. Okay. But they also talked about cars running through people and slaughtering people, knives. Okay. So they weren't specific to a single issue. And I think the political aspect of this problem and these is we're not focusing on the malfunction of the personality enough. And I think it would be amazing if you could get a category in the DSM like you have in your book. Okay. But actually get your peers to say, hey, wait a minute, let's stop for a minute and let's do an entire research on the personalities that came to the table.
Well, we're doing it. That's what's in progress. And to look at personalities, because it's more about that portion of what's under the umbrella of mental illness, coping skills and personality and life events. That's far more important than being psychotic or having some tradition, a classic biological mental illness. It's more like what has happened to you and how do you react to it. And that's why the culture changing has had such an effect on this. But to your point, Chris, what we found in the Columbia Mass Murder Database study was that people who basically can't get guns, have a harder time getting firearms, they use other means. And people who use other means that are more like ambient objects and things like that have more casualties and are far more likely to be psychotic. In other words, people who use things other than guns are far more likely to be more seriously mentally ill. So, and they have a lot more victims. So you drive a car into a crowd, you stab people randomly with a kitchen blade. In China, for example, there's a phenomenon where a person takes a blade to school and randomly stabs children. That's more common in China. That's kind of mass murder that's committed essentially by deeply deranged people who are emotionally unwell, who have a catastrophic life event and then act out, right? But so that's very interesting to me. In fact, Chris has an interesting point. That's how I was if you remember my profile of Koberger. Before Koberger was arrested as a suspect, I said this is a mass murder involving a knife. If a gun had been used, I would picture a less odd person. But a knife was used. So I picture a person that has some authentic mental health issues who will be peculiar.
Yeah, no, you nailed it.
And
you nailed this guy too. You nailed Chris too. And that's why I think it's important that we have this open discussion here, all three of us, about I think the politics of these types of events just exasperates the mental instability of those other individuals waiting to do this. They're waiting for somebody to come and say, you see, it's the tool. Okay. And then that person has so much paranoia within inside of themselves, it could turn into a triggering event, and we get copycats. And I think that's what happened in Columbine. Early on in Columbine, when everybody started going after, the craziness of the totality of that event, they weren't talking about what led up to it in terms of the pre-indicator behaviors, i.e., these kids, dressing all in black, listening to Gothic music, going in all the directions that they went to. I had somebody ask me what I thought about Brandon Wilson outside of, his pornography addiction.
Yeah.
They asked me, well, he was just crazy, right? And I said, you know what music he was listening to? And that person just stopped. He was like, what do you mean? What do you mean he was listening to music? I said, yeah, he was listening to Marilyn Manson the night of the murder of Matthew Checky.
Incidentally, since you mentioned Columbine, it's interesting because there you had two very different personalities, right? I mean, most people generally agree that Harris was a psychopath. If he had been an assassin, he would have been a Category 3 type, just a nihilist and a psychopathic guy. And his friend was more of a kind of depressed, odd kind of kid, right? Who got sucked into this thing with this powerful, persuasive psychopath. That doesn't mean he was an innocent or something. I just mean that one was more the ringleader.
Right.
And that. But now, one thing I know you wanted to talk about, Chris, and I think it's interesting, is that tied to this whole thing with Crooks is because of the fact that he was only 20 years old and he got this close to changing the course of history potentially. A lot of people might be inclined to think of him as a kind of, I mean, it's gross, but they might think of him as a kind of anti-hero, like he had some special intelligence or some special ability or whatever. But I think it had a lot more to do, I think you would say, with lapses in the people that were supposed to be preventing such a thing. I think it speaks more to that than it does about him having any particular intelligence or planning skills. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I'm worried about the isolation of the generation that's with us today, and that he's kind of he grew up with social media, right? But one of the things that I shared with you guys recently, I was at work. I have this case where how the kids are communicating through TikTok. And I think I remember I mentioned that where
Very strange story.
yeah, they're not talking to one another. They're not having this conversation, with you able to say, hey, Chris, you know what? You're wrong. Okay, let me explain why. And me go, oh, okay, yeah, fix me. Okay. They're not having that ability. Okay. And vice versa, right? You and I have been friends for a while. And it's an open conversation. Right. It's an open conversation, right? And I just wish you would remember I'm 3 hours behind you, though. I'm teasing you. That was a joke.
No. Hold on one
Gary,
second. Hold on one second. Gary, you don't, like, you struggle with the time difference with us, don't you?
I forget it all the time.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Anyway, let's get back to this thought. They're having a problem. They can't figure out what it means to communicate. Oh my goodness, that scares the beans out of me because the workforce is dealing with it. And now we see these kind of things like this where this kid is so isolated. He doesn't have a digital footprint, but up here he's got two parents who are counselors, and they're probably very good people. And their son is now is a potential presidential assassin. Okay. How do we get there as a society? Or how does this kid go from, less than a year ago or thereabouts, getting a diploma and saying, okay, the rest of your life, go conquer, okay, to, now I'm laying up on a building. There's got to be some type of isolation, society isolation, involved in this somewhere. I don't know. Am I in left field?
No, I mean, I think you're asking some really deep questions that lead to some disquieting, contemplation. But I have to say, Chris, that part of the problem with this whole thing is that if this kid was sitting and stewing in his mind, imagining that one day his name would be on everybody's lips, didn't he turn out to be right?
Yes, absolutely. But why?
That's the problem.
Why
Aren't we all talking about?
Right, but why are these kids even thinking like that? What's going on up here in the cranium, underneath the subdural? What's happening up here in the cranium?
Well, first of all, Chris, we live in a time when I have to say, I think belonging, whether it's because of social media or clicks or whatever, is that there's a exaggerated premium placed on being accepted by the crowd and getting the most likes and being the most popular and being having the most followers. And by the way, I hate that they're called followers because it makes everybody feel like a cult leader or something, right? That they have followers on social media. It's a creepy word, I think, to use. But I think that I personally think that everything that I have ever liked about myself as a human flows from being okay with being different than other people in some ways. I don't mind it. The essence of it is that you have to be okay with being different than other people. You have to have an underlying philosophy that makes it acceptable for you to not be like the mob. And I, for example, as a kid, was always very interested in my faith. And so if somebody bothered me, my interpretation of it was always through a spiritual lens. I always took it that, I believed something that they didn't understand or appreciate about me, and thought that, like, for example, I would be picked on that I didn't like to fight. I didn't like to fight because I had read in the New Testament certain things that made me think I shouldn't.
Yeah, you should have read the Old Testament. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Witness Box. We appreciate your feedback and support. If you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcast, please give us a rating. It helps us get discovered more. You can catch Chris McDonough on The Interview Room on YouTube. You can catch me on The Lab, also on YouTube. And you can catch Dr. Gary on both shows and this one, and his book, The New Evil, on Amazon and any major bookstore near you. Remember, it's not too much to ask to respect people's opinions and listen. You can make a huge difference in someone's day or life. On behalf of myself, Joshua Diaz, Chris McDonough, Dr. Gary Bricado, this is The Witness Box. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.